Look what I found. We've been searching and searching and searching for the heart of our story, and as if I found this. You imagine, I wish I had a map. I had a map with an X on it. X marks the spot. We've been sailing and sailing and sailing for years and years and years, and we have found the treasure, the story behind our investigation of the pirates, the clue to which, guys, I just like, I can't do this poetically. You got to be in here now, because this stream is going to solve absolutely all of it. Welcome to the Mosaic Arc. One. Okay, so it's a gem, which is, of course, because we do history here, actually a book. And I managed to persuade him to come on to the episode. Oh yes, our guest tonight is my University of Chicago colleague, James Vaughn, who has been hijacked by the Lady Pirates to come and explain where the bad guys come from. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I bet that's the only time you've ever gotten that introduction to your work. Yes.
Yes.
Are you regretting it already? He says, I am a serious historian. I study the history of the British Empire, and I am here to explain the background of the American Revolution to you, and instead it's pirates. Rather than this introduction, maybe we would please tell everybody who you are and how we know each other. You can give whatever version of the story you like on that. I think James has known me longer than maybe he. I don't know. We've been knowing each other a very long time because you were a graduate student in our department back in the beginning of time, or at least in the aughts.
Professor in the college, and I essentially teach in various civilization studies and social science sequences, as well as a couple of history electives. And I'm a historian of the British Empire and the Atlantic world in the 18th
Civilization,
century.
social sciences, big questions, right? And of course, James and I have been engaged in the last year in our staff meetings in these sequences and arguing over what the whole big story is, right? Well, we are here. All of those of you, we've got John Abrisi joining us from down under, right? Hi, John. We are here tonight to solve all of the big historical questions everybody on the internet has. I promise you. No, seriously, he thinks I'm kidding. Guys, tell him, right? What Casey, what have we been looking for? Other than the the giant gemstone, the proof of everything is in this stone. Yeah.
What people are traveling the world to get.
Rubies and emeralds come from the rivers of paradise. Did you know that? It's in Genesis. They flow down the Ganges and the Indus, and all of the gemstones in medieval Europe came from India. as did the spices, as did like all the good stuff, right? Yeah, so pirates want it.
Hmm.
Right? No, James, did you realize that this is what your scholarship is about? What did you think? Yeah, what did you think your scholarship was about?
Pirate. Oh, uh, um, in that book, I thought I was trying to figure out why um, the British Empire in India
Okay, see how
essentially
modest he
began in the
is?
way
He's
it
not like
began.
the domination of the world through the evil pirate cabal. No, seriously. This is why James gets invited to respectable conferences and I don't need because we are okay. So look, I think we need some help here. So we're going to set you up with the real backstory here. So everybody knows Cutler Beckett, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Played by Tom Hollander. Better known as so Tom Hollander. I know him previously from the sitcom Rev, where he's playing an Anglican priest who's serving in this London parish with like 6 parishioners.
I have to find
It's
that
he's
because he's very
really
funny.
good.
I only remember him
Sorry, you only remember him from what?
from Baddies.
Oh,
Was he
that's right. He
really?
was young. Was that
Yes.
him?
That was him.
Wow.
He's very young.
He's also in The Thick of It, if you've ever seen The Thick of It. It's
Okay.
another BBC
Oh.
sitcom. Okay.
Well, so we've established Tom Hollander's credentials. And of course, in our favorite movie, Pirates of the Caribbean, although this is in episodes 2 and 3, right? He is the baddie of the baddies, the one that in fact is like he wants Davy Jones' heart so that he can control the Flying Dutchman, so that he can capture all of the pirates and gain control of all of the shipping in the seas.
And he does it with such cold logic. It is completely logical why he wants to do it.
Oh
It's
yeah,
heartless.
yes, just good business.
Ironically.
Right? It's just good business. And of course, I was explaining to James backstage before we started when I first saw the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, I was convinced this was all completely made up. Right? Why?
Me too.
What?
It was. The more I learn about it, the more shocked I am.
Indeed, right? It's like it's the East India Company, and it's the Pirates of the Caribbean. There's a geographical problem here, right? It's like there's the Caribbean, and there's India, and there's Africa in between. I'm like, what on earth is the East India Company doing, worrying with the pirates in the Caribbean? And so I just dismissed it. I confess my historical ignorance. I simply dismissed the significance of the East India Company that Lord Beckett works for in this story of Pirates of the Caribbean, because what do I know about 17th and 18th century history? Basically nothing. I used to, right? I know a teeny bit more now. Like there were actually pirates, and there was this thing called the East India Company, and James here has written us a book about it, right? So who's the real baddie in the story? Is it Lord Cutler Beckett?
In my story?
Mm-hmm.
Oh no,
Ooh. Look, he looks
Robert
just like
Clive would be the arch villain.
him. Who is Robert Clive, and what should we know about Robert Clive?
Robert Clive originally started as a clerk in the British East India Company. He came from Shropshire. He was from minor landed gentry, landed elite background, and got a position in the East India Company as a clerk, did not like it, and became part of the military, and actually was a very, very successful soldier and officer just at the time that the British East India Company was starting to get into military conflicts with the French East India Company and their various South Asian allies. And so he rose up very quickly in the officer ranks and became a kind of leading East India Company general. They had private armies, they had private military forces in the Indian Ocean world. And he basically had very, very successful battles with the French East India Company and with South Asian rivals. And essentially, to make a long story very, very short, he is the one who delivers the great British victory in the 7 Years' War on the Indian front. The 7 Years' War is a kind of three-front global war between Britain and France, fought in Europe, America, and South Asia. And he's really the architect of the military victory of the British in the Asian theater, in the Indian theater of the 7 Years' War. And he then subsequently goes on to effectively found the British Empire in India. I can get into further details if
I
you
have
like.
so many
In the
questions.
wake of
I
the
have so many questions. Okay, so you're
Empire.
basically saying Lord Cutler Beckett is historically accurate. Wait a minute. No. So I thought, can you tell us a bit of the backstory? We need to know about what this East India Company was, right? We got ships. They got ships, right? The ships and we
sure.
let's take it. So we, in our writing of our great epic Draco Alchemicus, spent all last year learning about the 17th century, particularly alchemy, because that's very important in the 17th century, including things like the East India Company was actually started in 1600 under Queen Elizabeth, and that the very first ship that they sent from England to the East was called the Red Dragon. We like that a lot. Since we've got a dragon in our story. But what you're describing with Clive, and it's like he's got armies, he's fighting the French, was that what this company was supposed to be about? Tell us more about the opening story of this East India Company.
So,
we got some ships.
Good.
We've got some ships here. These are real ships, I think.
No, that's true. So at the turn from the 16th to the 17th century, in the kind of final days of the Tudor dynasty, Queen Elizabeth I extends a royal charter to a company of merchants in London that are basically, essentially, they're what will become known as the English East India Company, then later the British.
Okay, so it starts off as English and then it becomes British. Okay.
Yes.
And this is the earliest that there's. I want you to you guys. I want you all to hear this in excruciatingly great detail, because you'll realize we've been making nothing up. We've just been intuiting it. Where's my crystal ball? Right? Okay, so they start as a charter company with Queen Elizabeth, and they're English, but they're going to become British. Okay, I'm ready.
Yes, and at the beginning, there's nothing unusual about that. Meaning, the English crown had been chartering. You're getting a shift in the 16th century, particularly as you go towards the 17th century, away from focus of trade on the continent towards trade with the wider world. And the so-called long distance trades are developing, and it's not unusual to have a royal chartered company. You get it with the Muscovy Company going to Russia, and you get it with the Levant Company going to the Eastern Mediterranean.
Okay.
And so essentially a company of merchants in London agree to, they request a charter from Queen Elizabeth I. She grants it, and in return for it, she gets kind of loans and grants from these merchants. So that's the essential nature of the relationship. The English crown is chartering a company by which it's granting letters patent that essentially give this company a monopoly. And the monopoly that they receive from the very beginning is all English trade from the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa, to the Straits of Magellan. So basically, they give them a monopoly.
The charter means that it's preventing other English ships from competing with them?
Yes, precisely, because obviously they can't stop European traders. But basically, it says that no one, it effectively does this, Rachel. It says the crown is making this charter, and through the charter giving a kind of quasi-sovereign power to this company of merchants. And what is that power? That power is to completely direct and control all English traffic from the southern tip of Africa to the Straits of Magellan. So essentially the entire Asian maritime world. And it has to give them certain sovereign powers, like if from very early days, if there are other English merchants that are not part of the company that are trying to ply the trade between Europe and Asia, well, the maritime trade between Europe and Asia, then the company has rights to search and seize them, these kinds of things.
She's so sneaky.
So there was no sense that you could do what the Europeans were doing in the Americas and Asia, meaning you couldn't have conquistadors or colonial settlements. You couldn't send out military because Asia was such an advanced civilization and so well settled agriculture, towns, cities, all of that, great empires, the Mughal Empire, etc. You could not possibly hope to take territory and send colonial settlers. And you also couldn't possibly hope to do what Cortez did in Aztec Mexico. You couldn't conquer. You'd be, you have to go on this vast journey around the southern tip of Africa by the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean. And only bit of forces or manpower and material you could bring, Asian monarchies, Asian civilizations could easily repel. So they're very much, when the Portuguese go, when the Dutch go, when the French go, and the English go, they're very much going hat in hand and asking very nicely Asian potentates to grant them rights to trade in their areas and to recognize their monopolies. Meaning the Dutch, the English, the French, and Portuguese are all basically saying, will you grant us rights to trade here and wherever we are, China, India, and will you recognize that we're the only legitimate English merchants here? Okay. So their powers are really only against their countrymen.
That's so bizarre,
right?
It's like because the other thing that we are obsessed with is the pirates, because one that Elizabeth has spent her reign recognizing her pirates as privateers and giving them titles and ennobling people like Drake and Hawkins. You see, my dog has a significant name, right? And that this is enabling those kinds of people that have been serving her to hold the monopoly against their other countrymen. It doesn't even do anything against the Portuguese, who are like well established in India by this point, right? They can't.
Right. Right. I mean, really, there's no possibility that you could take territory or conquer anybody in the early 17th century in Asia. There's no possibility the Europeans can do that. They're going there as pliant. It's not like when they go to the Americas or they conquer and they colonize. They're going there as totally subservient, very deferential to the Asian rulers and asking rights to trade. But what happens is all of these mercantile companies that are chartered by the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, the English, they're given monopolies to prevent their own countrymen from trading there. And they're also given powers to deal with one another. Because, of course, the Portuguese try and keep the other Europeans out, and the Dutch have to essentially carve out through military force a space to trade in Asia. And then the Dutch and the Portuguese both try and keep the English and the French out, and they have to carve out a space. So all these in London, if you're looking there in the early 17th century, the early 1600s, in London, these are just merchants, and they've just come together in a trading house in order to pool their capital and pool their risk in a joint stock company. And therefore, they're merchants becoming directors and shareholders, and they're having shareholders meetings and directors meetings. And they look like just a regular commercial company. But however, if you look at what they actually send out to Asia in their ships, they have with them quasi-sovereign powers. They have powers to exercise force, police their monopolies, to uphold their trade. But that can only meaningfully be used against other Europeans, both their own subjects who are trying to be what they call interlopers. These companies call anybody who trades without their permission interlopers, or pirates. And they basically use their powers against their countrymen or against one another.
When did they make the leap to?
Oh, that's what we're getting to.
We're currently in the early 17th century. That's Clive in the mid 18th century.
Okay.
So why don't they do it from the beginning? Why aren't these simply royal fleets?
The Tudors don't have the state capacity to project power in Asia that could meaningfully conquer territory or take settlements. Like the Mughal
but they don't.
Empire.
But they don't even. The Tudors. Elizabeth doesn't even have the money to build the ships. I mean, it's like why not? This is I get what Casey. What we're finding out is in fact how they end up as imperial powers, but it's sort of curious to me that the merchants go to Elizabeth, say, please give us the charter, so please give us the monopoly. She says, yes, I give you the monopoly. But the only thing that she's basically able to do is give them the monopoly against other Englishmen. It's like
Yes.
It's not even real power outside of they sail down the Thames and that's it, right? The rest of it's up to their ability to keep their own ships safe.
Is it a case of they're all also the other country?
That's very much.
Yeah.
No, that's right, and it's actually not that unusual. That is the Tudors and the early Stuarts do everything through charters. So the settlement, the colonial settlement, the development of tobacco plantations of Virginia is all done by private companies, right? The New England, the Puritans, that's all being done through private charters and corporations, meaning the Tudors monarchy lacks any capacity to project power either across the Atlantic in the Americas or around the southern tip of Africa into Asia. So everything is done through charters to give adventurers and merchants who want to undertake the risk and pool the capital to do it, the abilities to do it. And then the Tudors will collect and the Stuarts will collect customs revenues from the trade, and they will collect loans and grants from the merchants. Because once you've got a charter from the crown can revoke the charter. So if the crown has financial difficulty, the crown can ask you for more money and loans and grants.
So here, John's saying, yes, all this talk about colonialism often misses how different it was in different places. It was business in India versus settlement of underutilized land in North America and Australia. And he does history of Australia, John does. So he's thinking about that. Okay, so how well does this go? This chartering of the East India Company. How do things play out over the 17th century?
Okay, so at first, it's usually just individual voyages because they're learning. They know nothing about anything going on in Asia, so they're learning over time, and it takes them a while, but they eventually develop a permanent joint stock. Meaning, initially they just pool their risk and capital for individual voyages. So
Okay.
we're sending ships out and we're bringing highly prized commodities. But what eventually they start doing this routinely, meaning you're constantly sending ships back and forth, and therefore you don't have a joint stock for just one voyage. You have a permanent joint stock. The corporation is always meeting, and there are always ships going back and forth. The Portuguese and the Dutch are able to keep them out of their key trade areas. And so what the English alight upon over the course of the 17th century is really in northeastern India and Bengal. That is where they really go to focus their trade. And that is really good, even though initially they think they're going out there to get into spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, spices, coffee, principally in Southeast Asia, the area called the Spice Islands. But the Dutch essentially successfully keep them out of there. I mean, they massacre, they set up a settlement at a place called Amboina, and the Dutch East India Company massacres all the English at Amboina. This remains a famous, like a feud between the English and the Dutch throughout the 17th century, this great massacre at Amboina. But to make a long story short, they don't intend to focus on Bengal, but they have to, because the Dutch have effectively shut them out of the rich pickings of Southeast Asia, the Spice Islands. And what they discover is that in Bengal, there is this incredibly easily accessible market in coastal Bengal is in northeastern India. It's in the area of the Indian Ocean known as the Bay of Bengal. and and because of the way the Ganges has developed, it's kind of very riverine, meaning there's all these rivers and that connect to the bay, so you can easily get access to the interior of the country. And what happens is Bengal is the world's leading cotton and silk piece good producing area, meaning because it's so fertile and it's so riverine, silk, there are silkworms, and they have incredibly easy, very little labor, with very little labor input. You can basically get silk and cotton. And then there's incredible manufacturing districts that have developed with spinners and weavers. And they have these brilliant dyes. I mean, basically, back in the Roman Empire, they were importing textiles from Bengal. And they're just brilliant because all the English have is really heavy woolen cloth. So the idea that you can get this beautifully cut, these textiles that are much lighter, cotton, silk, they're called in India chintzes, muslins, calicos, and they have a brilliant range of dyes, whereas the English are wearing, English common people are wearing very boring colors. So you can get, for the English East India Company can go into this market and buy for next to nothing because it's so plentiful in Bengal. They can buy all these beautiful cotton and silk textiles. And then because they have a monopoly, they can go back to England and basically charge an arm and a leg for it. So it's a classic merchant trading interest: buy low and sell high. And you can buy really low and sell really high because you have a monopoly in Asia. You're the only English merchants allowed to buy in Asia. And you have a monopoly in England. You're the only English merchants allowed to sell Asian goods in England. So you can really set the terms of your trade and make a killer profit. So just to bring it full circle, I'll stop after this. It becomes extremely lucrative. Like
I've got a sample of fabric here, which I thought was possibly appropriate, right? Because I think it's like paisley. Yeah, insane.
That's great.
Yeah,
no, that's great.
So and what the reason we know about the Red Dragon and the founding of the East India Company and stuff, we were reading about cochineal, the Mexican dye, right? That the Spanish are importing from Oaxaca. And one of I was looking it up, and one of the ships they capture, I think it was it was Madre de Dios. It was a Portuguese ship. It had both the rudders for the trade routes in Asia and a bunch of a big shipment of cochineal. So we understand, we in the Dragon Common Room of the Mosaic Ark understand the significance of color. and these dyes, it's like it's like huge. It's like also there's the horrible reality of what happens when you get synthetic colors and then you turn into the German chemical factories, and then no, we're not going to go to the 20th century. But the it's so easy now that we have all these chemical dyes to underestimate the power of a color in people's textiles and clothing. And so what you're describing, James, of the beauty of these cottons and silks, it's we think of cotton as something that you have t-shirts as underwear, right? It's just throwaway stuff, rather than this is the most exquisitely delicate, filmy, elegant fabric you've ever imagined in the world. Well, yeah,
but it's relevant because
the long history of the textile trade, which of course includes also destroying the Indians' textile trade. We're not there yet.
Yeah.
Okay,
no, that's right.
but the thing is, this is important. It's saying that I love the way you describe how this riverine environment makes all of these beautiful clothes. It's just it's heartbreaking to have it. Okay, so that's the East India Company in its original formula, because I recognize there's an original royalist foundation, and then something weird happens in 1688. First we have our favorite king, the Catholic, who sadly, okay, just jumping ahead, right? We skipped the Civil War. Don't worry about that. There's a lot of detail in English history. Have you ever noticed this?
Yeah, there is.
Why is there so much detail in English history?
Why
is it so well documented? This is a Marshall McLuhan question. Come on, you know the answer to this one. No,
Lots
newspapers
of power.
No,
and pamphlets.
so I don't want to. This is something that historians of England say, and I have no idea if it's true. It's been beaten into me since I first went to the archives in graduate school, that there is no single country with such a continuous, well-documented history for such a long span of time.
And
I don't know.
Well,
if that's
the thing
true,
is,
but that's
what you do
English
have for the
historians
17th
claim.
from the 17th century is just a ridiculous. Just as the fabrics that are coming from Bengal, the newspapers, newspapers of the 18th century, but the pamphlets and all of this argument that goes on in English history that you get, that's like so Steve was your dissertation advisor, right?
Yes.
Okay, so our colleague Steve Pincus, who was James's dissertation advisor, Steve and I have been in the department together forever, and he went away for a little bit to this other place in the East, and then came back. I'm moderately aware of the English Civil War, which Steve wrote a book on, and I'm moderately aware of, like, in our history of European civilization or Western civilization series. There's a whole volume that's the big fat blue one, Mark Kishlansky's edited volume. That's all of the detailed debates for the English Civil War. It's like the English argue a lot, and they argue it in print, and so we have the blow by blow of absolutely all of this stuff, which becomes relevant in the 18th century for lots of different reasons, but it's important to establish now. We have so much more detail about the factionalism and sides in these debates, particularly in the 17th and 18th century, than I think it's fair to say anywhere else. You have to have a certain kind of courage to be a historian of early modern England. I'm just giving that to you. Because no, seriously, it's like the rest of us get to, like, make up the other side or something, right? Because we only have one version of things. Exactly what was happening. Well, we only have this account, right? And it's like you only have Cicero's version of what happened, in the Civil War with Caesar, right?
Right.
So what happens in 1688 and why is it important? And tell us what happens to our favorite king and why he isn't king anymore.
I'm gonna have to break this to you. I'm sorry, I hate to break this to you, but he's a bad guy in this story, James.
Oh, that must be why he's wearing black armor. He's the bad guy.
Basically, the later century, the close relationship was developed between the English East India Company, particularly under James II's older brother and previous monarch Charles II. This relationship becomes really deep and profound. And the reason why that's the case is basically thus. The English East India Company is making a killing making a monopolist profit, having a monopoly of this trade to Asia, but above all to Bengal. And therefore, they can afford not only to pay high customs taxes to the crown, but they can afford to keep paying all these loans and grants the crown demands. So they can just give a cut of their ultra monopolist profit to the crown. And the crown, by the later 17th century, remember,
having had Charles, their dad's head chopped off, I don't blame them.
They want to rule without. Yes, but the problem with Parliament is whenever so the crown doesn't have enough personal income to rule the realm. It depends on calling all the lords, all the gentlemen and lords in the House of Commons.
This is a very important point here.
Raise taxes, the land tax, and the problem is Parliament doesn't raise that money without asking them, what do you want to do with it, Charles II? What do you want to do with it?
Oh, no. Doesn't Charles want to buy more dogs?
Yeah.
He's
basically
the Springer
parliamentary accountability. They want. Well, Charles wants to do lots of things with it, but sometimes he just wants to defend the realm, etc. But basically, Parliament will not give taxes without knowing what it's being spent on. And the crown, and this is not. I was half joking when I said James II's a bad guy, but Charles II, James II, they look across the channel and they see their brother and sister monarchs who essentially have a lot of independence of operation. They don't have to deal with the States Generals or Cortes or Diets or Dumas. they're just kind of jokes. Whereas the English Parliament is a serious institution, and therefore they'd like to rule without Parliament, which means they need another source of revenue. They need a source of revenue beyond parliamentary taxation. And the East India Company is a really key source of revenue for the crown, because basically you just invite these merchants to court and you say, we're going to raise the customs tax on you. And by the way, we want you to give us all this extra money in grants. And the merchants are happy to do that. Why? Because they're completely dependent on a royal charter. If Charles II or James II, what the king giveth, the king can taketh away. If Charles II or James II want to, at any moment, they can withdraw the charter. And thus they can withdraw the monopolist profits of the East India Company. And so yeah, and so to answer Rachel's question, by the eve of the Glorious Revolution, by the reign of James II, the East India Company is absolutely seen as Tory and Stuart and Charles II and James II, a wholly owned subsidiary of a kind of royal absolutism. And the Parliament and the Whigs absolutely loathe it.
Oh,
and so the Glorious
sad.
Revolution tips the tables.
And this guy comes
James
in.
II is overthrown. The Tories are basically put on the back foot. The Whigs are, William III, the Dutch stadtholder comes, William and Mary come in, and the Whigs are on the front foot. And basically the East India Company is on the back foot. And it's
James's daughter, isn't it?
No, they were already married. Yes, sorry, it's James.
Right.
James has two daughters, both of them Protestant, Anne and Mary. And Mary, Protestant stadtholder of the Dutch Republic, the Netherlands. And once James II has with his Catholic wife a Catholic heir, the future James III, that is the final kind of straw that breaks the camel's back, because they don't want a Catholic monarch, which they think is going to continue not as an absolute. The Dutch did, yes. At this point in 1689, it's not such a big problem anymore, because the East India Company has become hated by parliamentarians and Whigs, because it's viewed as a total kind of agency of the Stuarts and the crown.
Mm.
And so in fact, and in the 1690s, it's disestablished. They lose their monopoly. The Whigs control Parliament, and they control the chief ministries under William and Mary. And so they disestablish the English East India Company, and the trade is kind of thrown open.
See, this is when I learned this, because I did the deep dive in Wikipedia. I'm like, oh no, wait a minute. So how is there an East India Company that's such a big deal in the 18th century, right? Because and this is like there's not a there. It feels like there's just a it's founded in 1600 and it carries on into the present or into the 19th century, but in fact it doesn't, right? That there's this moment in 1688, 89 when it basically vanishes or it's completely disbanded.
Well, it's allowed to continue itself, but it can't have.
So they let other traders go in and compete with them now. Okay.
Yes, and basically, so that's what happens under William III, now King of England. Is they disestablish, or sorry, I shouldn't have said disestablish. That's an improper word. I'm sorry. They revoke the monopoly, but they allow the company to exist and just to compete.
So they establish free trade.
Essentially,
this is what I'm learning from your book when they're many of the times when they're talking about free trade in these debates, which we have excruciatingly detailed records of because of the English publishing habit.
That's
they mean against the monopoly, correct? It's like we want free trade, but it's not. Because I think when in the so one, as you're describing the Stuarts' relationship with the East India Company and this monopoly and the way that the companies depend on the royal favor, and the royal favor, the king depends on getting all that money from the customs. Wow, that seems so like topical right now when you have companies that are beholden in some way or another to the government. or the president. Which one is it? Not to Parliament, but to the king, right? But so when
right.
in the late 17th century, when they're arguing for free trade, they mean against these chartered monopolies. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes, the Whigs that are in the ascendancy in both Parliament and in the ministers of the crown, they move to reduce the powers of all these chartered companies and try and open up trade. So, for instance, the Royal African Company loses its monopoly of all trade in enslaved people in West Africa, and it never regains it. And the English East India Company loses its monopoly of trade to Asia, but eventually it regains it.
Dun dun dun. Okay, so the yeah, are we so we have now, thanks to, and this is I finished your book, but I'm still in the middle of Steve's book, so you'll have to explain what he says. What happens after 1688, and why is that a big deal? And I've got a picture here of the Thames, I think, with ships on it, which I understand is relevant.
No, that's true. So basically what happens is the Whigs oversee what historians have long called the commercial revolution, meaning an opening up of trade across the board to competitive enterprise. But two things happen that basically bring the East India Company back to life. One, it is allowed to maintain its trade. And in this period, it's referred to as the Old Company because now there are all these other traders. There's even a new company that's founded, a joint stock corporation to trade competitively with the old company, and there are private traders. But there's a huge problem in Asia, which is over nearly a century, the old East India Company, the now no longer monopoly old East India Company, has built all these settlements and all these fortifications and has established all these treaties with local rulers. So effectively, they have a huge advantage, which is they have a pre-existing network of trade. You can't trade in Asia, I should make clear for the audience. You can't trade in Asia by just sending out a ship and like hoping to dock at a port, right? You need to have a settlement. You need to have what's called in the 17th century a factory. They don't mean an industrial,
They mean
a
factors
mercantile
who's like
commercial
agents,
factory.
agents. Yeah, yeah.
Bingo. Yeah. And they've got to be resident. So you've got to go to a port city, like a port city in Asia, like a Madras or a Bombay, and you've essentially got to get an agreement from the local rulers to allow you to have a residency to set up shop so that people can live there. You can have clerks and who can live there, and then eventually you can fortify it and you have some soldiers that protect it. And then you have people who go into the internal Asia, what they go up country, they go into the hinterland and they buy the products that people want in Europe. And then they come them in these mercantile factories. And then the ships just come in, they pick up the goods and they leave. So by the late 17th century, you've got really routine trade, but you need a whole system of settlements and factories across the coastal port cities of Asia. And you need to have treaties and arrangements with all the local sovereigns and rulers. And so the old sorry?
Rulers were the ones that were
requiring them. You can't do trade in Asia without them. Meaning, if you just show up with one ship, you can't send men off the ship into the internal country to have to navigate with all the local rules and customs and have freedom of access and then buy goods and come back to the coast. It would be impossible. You lose your ship every disease to establish relations. And then you rent a little bit and then people there and then the goods coming in can just unload Asian goods and the ships can leave a few days later, right? That's basically it's become routine. So you have to imagine the old East India Company has decades of all of that stuff, of the infrastructure of Asian trade. And of course, it's theirs. They have the right not to allow other people to use it because now it's their private property. And William, exactly. And the old company is able to use its relationships and its connections to keep English competitors out. And then that's what happens. The old company used its advantage to prevent competitors from England to successfully set up a trade infrastructure. And then what happens back in Europe is effectively, now I'm not talking about the Glorious Revolution, but really the 25-year period that goes from the Glorious Revolution to the Hanoverian Secession in 1714. During that period, the Whig ruling elite develops into a kind of oligarchy of great aristocratic families. And as a result,
Yeah, this is the point in the book when I wrote Pigs is Pigs.
The old terms, but here's the difference.
New rulers have replaced the old rulers. Here we have the oligarchs of the Whigs who are, taking over the privileges that the old Tory oligarchs had had.
That's right. The one constitutional monarchy and a parliamentary government now. Parliament is, again, it's always in session, it's always meeting, and all future English and British monarchs agreed that they can't raise army or taxes without the permission of Parliament. That's why James II ultimately lost his crown, right? He was raising an army without the permission of Parliament, and he was raising some taxes without the permission of Parliament. And so as a result, basically no future English/British monarch will ever do that again. And so you have effectively a constitutional monarchy, meaning the monarch will never again rule without statutes and laws passed by Parliament allowing him to do what he does. But what happens, guys, is effectively the way I would think of it is like a Tammany Hall or a Daly machine. You have a constitutional monarchy and you have a parliament, but this is not a democratic parliament in any way. This is a parliament that is totally unreformed and unrepresentative and just represents the gentry and the aristocracy, the landed elite. And so the leading landed families of the Whig Party, they control permanent parliamentary majorities. And because they control permanent parliamentary majorities, they can tell the kings who they have to appoint as ministers. Because remember, the kings can't do anything without laws passed by Parliament. So the great families that control permanent parliamentary majorities can tell you who you have to pick as ministers. And so the Whig Party creates this whole system known as the Whig oligarchy, where a oligarchy of great, wealthy, landed elites, basically because they control permanent majorities in Parliament, get to choose the ministers of the crown and get to manage the monarchy. And it's in that period that they quite happily renew the charter. But this time, the charter doesn't come from the crown, it comes from Parliament. It's a parliamentary charter, which the Whigs don't have any problem with because they control Parliament. And then the old relationship develops. And what they force everybody to do is they force all the traders to go back into one company, and they call it the United Company of Merchants Trading to the East Indies, by which they simply mean everybody east of Africa. And so the old company is now unified with the new company and with all the other traders, and they become the United Company. And this United Company is a single joint stock company trading from London to Asia. And the parliamentary charter gives them a monopoly, the exact same monopoly. And it also gives them all the old quasi-sovereign powers to use against their own countrymen and, if need be, against other Europeans. And basically, to conclude, this is now what we call the British East India Company.
Right.
I'm talking post-1714, because England and Scotland have formed the United Kingdom. And we're now dealing with Great Britain.
Those factories are actually a medieval institution. Yeah, do you know Raimi Constable's work on the Muslim fundaks?
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So and when you were describing that, I know this because Raimi studied it. That it's a Mediterranean institution, and if you think about the way in which the Italian cities had trading arrangements with the Muslim powers, like in Alexandria or in the Holy Land, or I mean, I guess with the Ottomans and such, that they would have their own like warehouse and their own quarter in those cities, and as I remember her talking about it, the kinds of arrangements they had were very similar to what you're describing with the factories, that they didn't go inland. It's like the like Venetians and Genoese, right? Would just they'd have their factories or fundecs. They receive the goods that are coming across Asia and porting in the Eastern Mediterranean, and then carry them into Europe. So I mean, in more ways than I'd realized, the Atlantic traders that are now going around Africa are taking over institutions that they get from the Mediterranean. It sounds like. Yeah.
Oh no, that's a very good point. Yeah,
Right.
and
And
like
so
the
I'm
Levant Company in the
wondering
Eastern
now,
Mediterranean
as Ramey
is doing
described them,
all of
as
the kind of
I
Italian
heard her
stuff we're
talk about this a
talking
long
about.
time ago. These are the Muslim powers help set these up. What relevance does it have? Like India in this period was under the northern part was under Muslim rulers, right? The Mughals.
Yes. Technically, the Mughals claim all of the subcontinent, but they don't have effective control over all it. And the Mughals are an Islamic Persianate empire that came over
So maybe
precisely
do they perhaps
that
do the
they
Mughals bring
conquered
this
basically the
fundak
pre-existing Hindu
factory
civilization.
system into India? Is that mm,
That's an excellent question. That really is an excellent
right?
question. I don't know if the Mughals do it or if the Portuguese and Dutch are so used to what the Italians have done in the Eastern
That's so
Mediterranean.
good, right?
But
Because I mean,
the
this is
Portuguese and
obviously one
Dutch
of
bring
my
it there before the
ongoing
English and the French
stories
do
is
it.
that we're in the same story, right? It's just like one, and when we're trying to understand these institutional developments, for example, as you're describing Parliament as well, that the English Parliament has a different history from the French. I mean, in the 17th and 18th centuries, of course, the Estates General aren't even meeting because they aren't called between what 16 something early 17th century and 1789, which has
Right.
explosive effects when they're called then. Uh, and the English Parliament has been king-making since the 14th century, but maybe since the 13th century, right, with Magna Carta, when they remonstrate with John, and then in the 14th century they first replace Edward II with Edward III after humiliating Edward II, and then it's Parliament who actually votes that Richard II isn't king anymore as well, and replace him with Henry Bolingbroke. So yeah, this is okay. So what I was thinking of, I was thinking
You know
various
much
things
more
about my
this than I
introduction,
do.
right? It's like
Yeah.
one of the things that's wonderful about this. You and I have known each other for a long time, and I had no idea that this is what you worked on properly. Sorry, but you didn't know I knew this, right? It's like, so much of our study of history, and everybody on the internet needs to like calm down and stop being so conspiratorial in certain ways. You don't know what the significance of the piece of evidence is until you can put it in the narrative that you're studying. And I didn't know, I knew a little bit about, the English Civil War and things like that, but
Yeah.
all of these elements of why India mattered so much, why the East India Company matters so much, why these, very particular institutional developments from the factories to Parliament to this oligarchy to the Whigs versus the Tories. It's so, we get too much history at this sort of, I'm reading Deepesh's book on provincializing Europe now, so this is context for you, that we've got this 19th century theorizing abstraction about everything. Oh, we're going to talk about capital, or we're going to talk about industrialization or something like that. We don't understand why things take the precise shape that they do without the old East India Company, which was the English East India Company, was closely allied with the Stuart monarchy, but by the the early 18th century, it's been reformulated and taken over by the oligarchic Whigs, and that changes everything, right? It's like we have to have this level of detail in our history, otherwise nothing makes sense.
Yes.
And calm down, right? Yeah. Right, you just heard the last half a second of it, and the feeling of also, I think this is our commercial break for modernity, or why modernity needs to get a grip, right? That the when we're trying to understand why our institutions have the structures that they do, I learned so much from James's book about, in fact, why the United States is having the arguments that we are right now, not just about business, but about representation and government and what kind of government we have and why our Constitution is what it is. And the frustration that we have about you guys aren't learning enough history. You don't know enough of the detailed step-by-step story to get why things took the shape that they did after all of these centuries of negotiation. If I just told you that, these factories that they're using in the 17th, 18th century are a medieval institution, it's like none of these things happen overnight. You can't invent institutions out of nothing. You can, but okay, I need to rephrase that. It helps to know how all of these things have been negotiated out to understand why we have the convictions that we do. Commercial over. All right. So this is great. So we now understand why the new East India Company is now the British East India Company. It's established. It's reestablished its monopoly, but now with a different kind of government backing. Where I slipped over my picture of Beckett drinking tea. Is tea part of the story now? Is this like got tea in it yet, or have we?
So sorry. So as we go deeper now, so now we have, basically the old company's trade infrastructure is now the trade infrastructure of the United East India Company, which includes the old company and its former rivals, all in one organization. And the United Company, as I said, is a patronage and oligarchic of the big families, this Whig oligarchy, Britain through parliamentary majorities
and to say the Whigs are real. There's this thing called
and
Whig historiography, right? The Whigs are really good at making their own case. Always. They write a lot, and so I this is the other sort of footnote, advertisement kind of thing, is seeing how they make their arguments and the rhetoric they use, like liberty, right? They're all talking about liberty at this point, right? So explain what the Whigs mean by liberty in this moment, because these are oligarchs in control of a massive monopoly,
absolutely.
and they're talking about liberty.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Okay. So I think by this time, so let's say now we're in, say, the 1730s and 40s, right? And you've got the dominance of the Whig oligarchy and really this dominant prime minister, Robert Walpole. They have this basic view that the great enemy of mankind was what they call arbitrary power. And that arbitrary power was what the Stuarts were trying to build by having an absolute monarchy that ruled without parliament and without having right. So their basic view of liberty is not a monarchy ruling through law and subject to constitution, i.e. that the monarchy rules through parliament and through laws and statutes and can't through prerogative suspend any of that stuff. And private property, that nobody can have private property taken from them without a law passed in parliament. So in other words, they make a link between representation and but of course, what they mean by representation is virtual representation, that the landed elite represent the whole realm because they're a leisured landed class and they have time to be educated and debate and meet in the House of Commons and House of Lords and discuss great issues. It's understood that they virtually represent all of the realm and its overseas possessions. They have this virtual representative. And then finally, what they mean by liberty is the Protestant settlement, that any Catholic monarchs will try and rule arbitrarily and reimpose Stuart absolutism. So that's their conception of liberty, right? Their view of liberty, property, Protestant settlement. No, they're like a Daily Machine or a Tammany Hall, right? But to be fair, they do have elections.
It's like a board of governors election, rather. The stockholders, or right? Yeah.
right. Well, yeah. Yes, the Dutch and the British East India Company now are they're in the 18th century, they're blue chip. Like the two leading stock markets of the 18th century are in Amsterdam and London.
Mm.
And both of those countries, East India companies are blue chip stocks, very safe, right? Like you can basically buy their stocks and it will be quite safe.
Except for that, I mean, there's
Yeah,
the
it's
South Sea
quite,
bubble is in the 1720s. Is that right?
yeah,
So there, the
exactly.
market is susceptible to these
Pre-1720.
bubbles.
Absolutely. And the South
Okay.
company is a massive bubble. Yeah, but that's where the East India
Okay.
Company
So
looks like
I
on the
I
eve of
just
the
need to know
7
where the
Years'
T
War,
is right
essentially,
now.
this new British East India Company.
Have they stolen it from China yet?
Oh, sorry, apologies. Apology.
Okay.
So the textiles from
Okay.
Calcutta, sorry, Bengal are still by far the most prized commodity, but now they're expanding out. And you have to think we're now in the mid 18th century, and the Portuguese have really been eclipsed. And while the Dutch dominate what is today's Indonesia, Southeast Asia, the British and the French have really become leading European players in Asia, right? Particularly in South Asia. And that's we're starting to now get an interest in tea from India, tea from China, etc. And that's becoming increasingly.
Okay. But the tea,
But
I did
that's
read the book on
on to what is
one of the tea commodities books that they have to steal the better tea from China and figure out how to plant it in North India, right? And
get into details about that. They absolutely are in the areas they trade in. They are commodities, but in some other area of Asia, and they'll take it there where they can control the conditions of the production and make it. But tea really starts to become important once they have an empire. It's a minor player. Once they get the empire in
okay,
the
so
60s, it
Beckett
becomes
sitting
a
here with his
major
tea. I mean,
player.
I love the
Tea
scene.
in their
There's a
trade.
scene at the end of. You're gonna have to rewatch these so you see how topical this all is. There's there's a scene at the end of 3 Pirates of the Caribbean 3 where the pirates are flanking Beckett's ship because he's been so stupid as to think he could take them out. And he's sitting there drinking his tea, right? And so he has to, which I think is another of the themes that we have in our storytelling with Draco Alchemicus is our title of our story, which is like the drug dragon, basically, right? We started with the premise that the way in which modernity has entranced and captured everyone is basically through drugs, which includes the spice trade, it includes the tea and coffee trade, includes sugar. I mean, all these great plantation crops, which turn into the slave driving industries of the 18th and 19th centuries. Whether cotton counts as that or not, I'm not sure. And so, the Beckett is here sitting. We think of the tea as this preeminently civilized performance, but it's basically a guy doing his drug rituals with his china. I'll now have some more wine.
Yeah, and in fact, by the way, I think he's passed away, but it was a really important South Asianist named David Washbrook, D.A. Washbrook.
Yeah.
And he famously referred to one.
Yeah, that chimes with what we've learned. and the thing is, yes, we in I say the Dragon Common Room is our poetry writing parent thing. The Mosaic Arc is where we are right now, right? We have noticed that this kind of relationship adheres presently in many industries. we are therefore very curious about where our country is exerting military force right now. Yeah, it's quite overt, right? It's like which empire are we going to bomb next? Oh, let's look at we got a map of India here in 1751. You've been mentioning some other empires that were at war over this region, James.
So should we move now into the
So I think we've
actual
now established
empire?
the complexity of the history of the company, the significance of the political situation behind these economics. I become fascinated with economic history in the last few years. It's wonderful. Um, I used to think it was so boring. The degree to which it's caught up in drug trades and not just money making, but also this sort of like huge money making. We have touched on the opium trade a number of times in our podcast. We've also done episodes on sugar and things like that. So the it comes into this as an element. The significance of colors and textiles. Okay, the French.
Well, basically, what happens is that by the mid 18th century, so we're now in the 17th, but for reasons we don't have to get into, basically it's weakening, and the power of the Mughal center from Agra over the rest of the subcontinent is weakening.
If you say it's weakening,
And
but is
so
that
the
because of
emperors
European
destroyed.
shenanigans or internal? Okay.
It's more internal. It's more internal. Although certainly the Europeans don't call it, the Europeans accelerated. It, yeah, it's internal, and what essentially is happening is, while if you look at things theoretically from the perspective of law and sovereignty, the Mughal Empire is as powerful it's always been in the 1750s. But if you look at practically on the ground, the viceroys, that is the regional governors, basically Nababs are the really a shadow sovereign, and his regional governors are becoming local kings and dynasts. They're passing on to their children their governorship, their rule. It used to be Nawabs and Nizams. They would be appointed by the emperor and removed by the emperor. And when they died, somebody else would be appointed. But now basically they're turning their own little governorships into kingdoms, basically. And so the Nawab of Bengal is in a practical way. He's no imperial, and he's passing on to
So
his
wait. Can
his
how
brain. So
I want
that's a
you've
picture of the Mughal.
described the fabrics, the beautiful fabrics they're making in Bengal. What kind of like political structures, civic structures, societal? They're Muslim over a Hindu population, but they're administratively sophisticated. They're like exactly what's crumbling.
Now that but here's the thing. It used to be
Mm,
the old historiography. If you looked at the Oxford
okay.
or whatever it was called in 1900, the story was purely
Mm.
decline, fall of the Mughals. In the 1960s, there's been a massive
and craftsmanship and it was like the commerce. And I'm just really fixed on, I did not know this properly. I mean, it's one of these things I've learned recently. What the British do to the textile industry there is criminal.
Yeah.
And
And the local Nawab
because
knows that.
because first they come in and they buy all these beautiful fabrics, and then the Industrial Revolution is happening at home, and the American South cotton, I think, is part of the, like you're saying to us, James II becomes a bad guy in this. Exactly who comes out as the good guy in any of this?
No, I just meant in terms of
Oh no, I just had my Civ students do an exercise of, look at the Industrial Revolution, tell me the good side and the bad side of it. So this is my regular exercise, right? Because we're it's like, whose side do you take when you tell the stories? Well, I mean, like, what are we looking at? So we're looking at in 17th, 18th century India, industries that are so well developed that they, have fabrics that no one in Europe is able to make at the time. I mean, even the Italians, right? The Italians have been specializing in magnificent fabrics for centuries, and well, they do okay. I mean, that will get us into color alchemy and the problem of dyes and everything like that. But the reality is the textile industry in Bengal is it just sounds like it's fairly productive, and it's well organized when the British.
It's the world's leading textile industry. Yes,
right.
absolutely.
Yeah. That's what I'm trying to
Nawab
establish.
is aware of how much seaborne overseas trade is important. He wants as many merchants coming there to pick up goods as possible, pay customs revenues, etc.
Boy, did he make a big mistake. Okay, carry on.
So that's what's happening by 1750s in South Asia. Back in Europe, there are new developments because there had been relative peace after the death of Louis XIV of France, the great kind of Bourbon monarch of France in 1715. And because England and France had more or less from the Glorious Revolution to the death of Louis XIV in 1715. And following that, there's relative, but by 17, France is asserting itself. And then another quarter century of warfare breaks the War of the Austrian Succession. And that ends in 1748, but it's really a hot peace or war.
Right.
There's a renewed war known in this as the French and Indian War that starts in 1754 and is known in Europe as the 7 Years' War starting in 1756. But really, it's all one. And what you have to think is whether you're in Versailles, the kind of headquarters of France geostrategy, or you're in London, the headquarters of British geostrategy, the rulers of Britain and France basically view themselves as not merely European powers, they view themselves as global powers, vying for who's going to be the world's leading imperial power. And they view their European allies as just in one theater, right? Britain has an ally, initially Austria and then later Prussia as well. And then France has an ally, initially Prussia and then later Austria and Russia. But they just view Europe as one theater. They view the New World as another theater where they have colonists and they have indigenous allies, the French, the Huron, the British, the Iroquois. And then finally in South Asia, they view themselves as basically competing to promote their companies. And in South Asia, a perfect storm happens, which is you have to think by the 1750s, you have post-Mughal successor kingdoms that now are vying with one another to become the leading hegemon in South Asia, right? So all these post-Mughal successor kingdoms, they're no longer afraid of the imperial center, and they themselves would like to become the new dominant power of South Asia. And they're vying with one another. And now the English and French are vying with one another all over the world. And basically the British and the French East India Company, and there's no plot,
there's no reason to it, or there's no like sneakiness.
The British and
okay.
No, I mean there is sneakiness across the French are at throughout almost the entirety of the 1760s and the early 1760s. And basically, in this conspiracy, French company simply want to protect their trade amidst all wars going on between the successor kingdoms. And not initially. Initially, their basic view is we can't project power here, but we have to make sure to protect our trade and our property. So we have to make sure that we make deals and we keep connections with the post-Mogul successor kingdom likely to win. They want to be on the winning side of what is in South Asian rivalry. Here's where the sneakiness comes in. The French and the British began to realize that they back a successful claimant. Now, by the way, not only are kingdoms fighting one another, but because they're relatively new political communities,
Right. Yeah.
have a lot of rival claimants in terms of usurpation and plots. And the British and French initially, they think side of these usurpations because we want our trading rights, private property. But then they begin to think, if we back somebody to overthrow somebody else, maybe we can convince them to get rid of our enemy. And to be fair, I'm not just trying to be an Anglophone historian here, but the French really start
this is the beginning of the color revolution. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
Who really
the French did it.
sells the monarchy of Louis XV. The East India Company sells to Louis XV that we can basically back different rulers to come to the throne. And when they come to the throne, they will give us exclusive trading rights and kick out the British.
Okay, this goes back to the Middle Ages too, you know.
So it's still a commercial. Okay, but it's still, believe it or not, even though some trickiness and some craftiness is coming in, it's still a commercial logic. Nobody wants territory.
Was he from Calais? Was with this particular?
But then no, but slowly, what then begins to evolve is essentially the British and the French get used to participating into high politics in South Asia and geopolitics in South Asia, sitting in courts and helping choose rulers and helping write trade deals. And they have a growing sense of their power. And then finally, guys, and I'll conclude here, because the British and French crown are fighting globally, they're now backing their East India companies globally, and they're sending their royal navies out to South Asia. So what you have to realize is by the late 1750s, after almost a quarter century of global fighting, now the British and the French are used to being involved in South Asian high politics. They're used to helping pick rulers. And they've got royal navies backing them, and they've really built up their military forces. Initially for defense, they're only trying to defend their property and their trading settlements, but now they feel themselves to be increasingly power players in South Asia.
I bet this was expensive.
That's
I
enter
bet all
Robert
of this was
Clive.
expensive.
Right. He comes. It was expensive, but if you can eliminate your rivals and have total.
Okay. It's expensive because the 7 Years' War makes debt for both sides, right?
It makes a lot of public debt. A lot of public debt, yes.
Can you explain that? Because this is these are textbook level American history things now. The 7 Years' War, and therefore they're in big debt. And that's why, fill in the blank, right? I use it when I teach the French Revolution, right? It's like they got into massive debt because of the 7 Years' War, and that's why Louis XVI has to call the Estates General.
I can do it best through.
Okay, so my next picture is George III. Is he king yet?
He is about to be king, but
we have to go to Plessy next.
Yes,
okay.
Plessy, exactly.
With the elephant. We've got the elephant.
So by this point, Robert Clive is the most celebrated commander, because throughout the 40s and 50s, as the French and the British East India Company have been fighting in South Asia, he's really risen up the ranks. and now he's the chief military commander of British East India Company forces in South Asia. And he totally defeats the French. And most famously, there is a French allied ruler of Bengal, the Nawab Siraj ad-Dawla, who basically Siraj ad-Dawla, who's alive, he moves to kick the British out of Bengal. He goes to take Calcutta.
What
This
is it?
the famous
What's the black hole?
Calcutta, right?
Is it a prison or a?
Oh, so what happens is Siraj ad-Dawla is really upset with the British because they evade taxes, they're not paying taxes, and a lot of other reasons. He's allied with the French. And while they're official, Calcutta is a very hot environment. The East jail in Calcutta is quite small and not very large inmate population, and the way the Bengal deals with it, he jams the ball this very small, and as a result, people suffocate and die. It's not intentional. It's more like an ad hoc fog of war thing, if that makes sense. But it becomes this cause célèbre back in Europe, known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. And the Nawab of Bengal is considered the most cruel despot, right? Because he has ordered this. He never ordered it, but he is perceived as ordering this. He did order the taking of Calcutta, but Calcutta, by the way, guys, is just this British trading settlement on the Ganges in northeastern India, where the Bay of Bengal and the Ganges meet. So it's very well placed both to ply the coastal trade of the Bay of Bengal, but also this riverine network of the Ganges, right? So Calcutta is perfectly positioned. It was initially just a small trading settlement.
I've got an Australian footnote from John
with Europeans and Asians.
It was France's La Perouse voyage that settled the British on Australia. Like I said, that they wanted to go to Australia. They had to beat the French, and so the British opted to exploit Cook's discoveries. The convicts were a labor force. Australia then became a holiday and retirement place for East India Company soldiers and sailors.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's fascinating. So
Australia comes out, and it's like so many things come out of this Indian War. It's fascinating. I mean, it's like including like they're still fighting at the end of the American Revolution. Right. So it's this another of the great things I learned from your book is how much this theater of war affected the United States. And now John is saying it's also, Australia's closer, right? So you think of it as at least regionally related, but that the events that happened in India in these years are part of the reason we have the United States. It's right. So mind blown. In the midst, yeah, right. Well, it's this naval battle off the south of the Coromandel coast. Is that our place? Yeah, okay.
A few months later, news arrives in Europe that this has happened. And I cannot emphasize enough the shockwaves this sends throughout Britain. Because not only does the East India Company is now a global trading company, but the entire trade is centered around the textile trade in Calcutta. So the loss of Calcutta is essentially the loss of its chief commercial and corporate function. And the reason why this sends shockwaves throughout Britain is the British East India Company is the number 2 institution after the Bank of England in the whole financial system of Britain.
Would you say it's too big to fail?
The audience, this doesn't just mean the loss of profitability and dividends for company directors and shareholders. If the British East India Company fails, of ripple effects through private markets, through the London financial market, but also massive ripple effect public. The British East India Company is the greatest stakeholder in government. If it fails, that means Britain will become less creditworthy. And to get any loans or government will have to massively higher interest rates and raise even higher taxes. So this is viewed by all the ruling elites of Britain as a complete and utter disaster. The British East India Company must be saved at all costs. Calcutta must be recovered at all costs. So a squadron Navy to go help the British East India Company military forces under Robert Clive retake Calcutta. Still lies in the minds of King, the grandfather of King George III, when all these forces are being sent and when they come in 1757 to retake Calcutta, it's defensive. It's about retaking Calcutta. So Robert Clive works with their British Royal Navy, British public power is now in India because the Royal Navy belongs to the Crown. It doesn't belong to the East India Company.
So it's like a private, it's a private army?
Is the East India Company is headed by Clive.
Wow.
They retake. Yes, the army is the private force of the British East India Company, but the Royal Navy, which
so mercenary forces, it's like these are paid soldiers, right?
Army. Yeah, they're paid
a
soldiers.
Corporate army.
Oh yes,
corporate army.
And now it's really built up through a quarter century of war, right? But anybody who alone they have international fund market, meaning Netherlands, a lot of people. There's everybody from a haberdasher that has put in 50 pounds. All obviously the vast majority of the government debt is owned by wealthy financiers and merchants throughout Europe, not just in London, but Paris and Amsterdam as well. What?
Right.
Not the company. No, sorry. The English, the Bank of England is like a Federal Reserve. It's half public treasury bills, which gives you, if you hold on to the treasury bills, you can pay the treasury bills to other people. Currency. You hold on to the bills.
See what's right. Well, this is the thing. It sounds very familiar. And what I'm fascinated by is I feel like for my entire adult life until this minute, my understanding of modern finance has been obscured by the capitalism versus communism debate. When this is much more relevant, the private armies maybe not, but the sort of the degree to which the governments are dependent upon these private companies. And the government issued monopolies, or it's like this whole. I feel bamboozled by the whole. Oh, it was mercantilism. Is this mercantilism? Is this what people mean in the textbook version of mercantilism? I didn't even know anymore. It's like your description of what is going on here. It makes so much more sense.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, when you have
thank you.
500 years, mercantilism is one of these terms I only find useful if you're teaching like a survey of 1,000 years of history.
I don't even find it useful at all anymore because it's like the way you've broken it all. It's like feudalism, right? You ask me feudalism and my mind will explode because I'll have to explain it all, right? That the feeling of this is the kind. What Casey's saying, this all sounds totally familiar. This is exactly the sorts of financial entanglements that we seem to be beset with now.
Absolutely. And
really relevant is in the last half.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's a great point. That's a great point. And now just to take the narrative up, basically the Royal Navy has secured the Bay of Bengal, and Robert Clive's military force has marched up from Madras, which is on the Coromandel coast, to Calcutta, and they retake Calcutta. But basically they decide, and again, I know it's really is defensive at this point. They decide that that Calcutta can never be permanently secure with the current Nawab of Bengal, Siraj Adawla, on the throne, because he tried to take Calcutta from them arbitrarily in their self-understanding, and he's allied to the French. So their basic view is they have to defeat Siraj Adawla, and they make a deal with a guy named Mir Jafar, who is Mir Jafar, who is a Bengali member of the Bengali ruling elite who has been wanting to take over the rule of Bengal, and a deal is made, and there's a battle at Plassey, which is an orange grove, a grove of oranges. It's a rural area. It's far outside of Calcutta. It's an orange grove, and basically Siraj Adawla and his Bengali forces are going to face Robert Clive and his East India Company military force. But a backroom deal has been cut through correspondence where a significant part of the Bengali force withdraws. Mir Jafar's force withdraws, and Siraj Adawla's force is easily defeated. He runs away and is eventually killed. And then what's in this picture that Rachel has shown at Plassey, that's Mir Jafar and Robert Clive meeting after the battle, and therefore enacting their secret agreement, which is that Mir Jafar will now be the new Nawab of Bengal, and he will restore the company to even great. Not only will he restore Calcutta and all the company's private property and settlements, but he'll give them even greater commercial benefits and deals where they can make even more money. And at this point, guys, it really has had a logic that has been defensive and commercial. But here's where Robert Clive basically decides, and almost immediately after he helps put Mir Jafar on the throne of Murshidabad, the capital of Bengal at the time, he really decides that the East India Company should not stop there. That the Royal Navy is there. The British East India Company has a gigantic military force now. The Royal Navy has been able to project power into the Indian Ocean, Bay of Bengal. His basic view is they actually should themselves become the rulers. And he writes a very famous letter in 1757 to the then British Prime Minister, William Pitt the Elder, the future Earl of Chatham, and the father of the later Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger. And he says, we can use a relatively modest force and take Bengal, and he says, become the Nawab in the de facto Nawab. We can make the Nawab purely a de jure Nawab, and will be the de facto Nawab, will run things. And he basically tries to sell this as, if we control Bengal, we can collect 4 million pounds sterling, which is a lot of money. It's an incredible amount of money in the 18th century. And we can use half of it to keep a tax collecting bureaucracy and army in Bengal, 2 million pounds sterling. And then we can send 2 million pounds back to London, where we can prop up the national debt and the stock market and everything that appears to be on the brink of teetering. Now, the British Prime Minister at the time, William Pitt the Elder, rejects this. He thinks this is a terrible idea. He thinks this will involve the British in having a land empire in Asia. And you're going to think I'm joking, guys, but the line I'm about to say is
I'll try not to laugh too loudly.
The line I'm about to say is not it's not original to the screenplay writers of The Princess Bride.
Oh yeah.
You guys have seen The Princess Bride? Do you remember when the Sicilian says never get involved in a land war in Asia? That is British. No, but that is British common sense. You do not want a land empire in Asia because you'll be involved in endless warfare with the highly populated, well-settled civilizations.
You think we'd have learned?
It will ruin your trade. No, but That's Pitt the Elder's view. He says, no, we don't want an empire of conquest in Asia. It will involve us in being sovereigns and imperial rulers. In other words, he says very clearly, we are not a Roman empire. We are not an empire of conquest where we extract tribute. We're an empire of liberty, which is we either, I mean, I'm telling you their self-understanding, make of it what you will. But their basic view, the British, or Pitt the Elder, adheres to the old classical British view going back to the Glorious Revolution, which is we're an empire of liberty. We are either an empire of seaborne trade, or when we possess land, it's because no one was there, i.e. North America, or we made treaties to buy it from the people legitimately, and they could be easily displaced, and we sent our own settlers out, and those settlers have rights in government and local representative assemblies. So the British have an idea that you should only ever take land when you can buy it from people and remove them easily.
I mean, come on.
And send your own, well, self-governing settlers, right? Self-governing settlers, and you should trade. And in Asia, you should only trade. You do not want to be involved in Asia, because if you get an empire in Asia, you'll have to rule like the Spanish do in South America and in Mexico, or you'll have to rule it like the Persians or the Romans do. You'll have to have a Roman-style landed empire with vast legions. And Pitt says literally that's a recipe for autocracy. You will eventually, have a Roman-style massive legions that will require you to overthrow parliament and constitutional monarch and rule autocratically.
So of course they all listen to him.
He says no. But to make a long story short, they did initially. I mean, Clive isn't able to do that initially. But what happens is there's recurring crises. Now, the 7 Years' War ends in 7 a complete British victory. Are no longer. But the problem is that two Nawabs of Bengal, a guy named Mir, he basically wants to reassert control in his area, and unsurprisingly, he doesn't like how many commercial privileges and abuses the British East India Company is doing. So he tries to put them in their place. And as a result, that causes a panic in Britain in 1764. Basically, Mir Qasim, and this is after the 7 Years' War, this is peacetime. Mir Qasim did not like how powerful the British East India Company has come. They really have a lot of privileges, which they have a lot of influence in politics. Reduce them back to being a commercial power on him, and they like that, and a war breaks out, and essentially it looks like he's going to be able to kick them out of Bengal, and that news comes back to London in 1764, and it sends shockwaves not only throughout the British East India Company, but throughout the financial market, throughout public credit, throughout the newspapers, throughout the public sphere. And it's really in this context that Robert Clive, who has been promoting the idea of a territorial empire that the East India Company controls in Bengal for now 7 years, he's seen as, oh, we have to go with Clive. It's really now under a different prime minister named George Grenville, where the decision is made, we have to back Clive in his plan. He has to be sent back to Bengal, and we have to allow him to basically create a much more powerful military bureaucratic empire. And effectively, that's what he does. He gets control of the, yeah, exactly. He gets control of the British East India Company in the spring of 1764. He returns that summer of 1760. He basically is going to be absolute of all. And when he finally arrives in 1765, he goes back.
I've got that one.
Now he's in Bengal, in Calcutta, and he goes up country. You have this image, Rachel, to Allahabad, where he meets the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II. And he basically says, I've left something out. I apologize. The British East India Company forces in 1764, while set sail in the summer of 1764 to go to Bengal, but it takes many months for him to sail to Bengal. So while he's sailing, the British East India Company actually defeats Mir Qasim at something called the Battle of Buxar. And so they totally defeat a Nawab's forces. So when Clive arrives, he basically is an absolute ruler of the British East India Company's forces, and they've totally laid low Mir Qasim and the Nawab. And it's in this context that Clive decides to go up country to Agra and say, I want you to give me the Divani, which means basically
I call that
the
feudal lord,
revenue-raising
but you
tax.
seem to use different terminology.
And in August,
Long live feudalism.
no, I mean, yeah, but essentially that's what it is. In August, and depicted in this image, in August of 1765, with the Treaty of Allahabad, the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II is granting the sovereign power of Bengal, financial, tax revenue, effectively law and order maintaining power, external defense power, to the British East India Company. And so now, as of August 1765, we can say that the British East India Company is not just a commercial company operating out of London and publicly traded, but it now has sovereign power, tax collecting, revenue raising, law and order administrating, external defense powers over 20 million Bengalis,
Yay.
Muslim and Hindu, largely peasant cultivators.
I mean, mind blown, right? He's basically, it's like he's exactly a feudal lord. He's got his own army. He's been given, the collection. He gets to collect the revenues off of that. It's his fief, and he serves at the pleasure of this. I mean, so it's interesting because it is a company. And in your book, you describe how Clive. There's also ways in which Clive is saying we need to do this because it helps, more rhetoric, right? It helps cut down on corruption. Right. I will administer this fairly and bureaucratically and with auditors to make sure that, everything's being done above board. But it's a feudal power. He's been given this administrative jurisdiction over the peasants.
Yeah.
It just blows my mind.
In this sense, the company immediately begins developing bureaucratic.
Just like the Carolingians. He's like the Carolingians.
Tax raising, revenue collecting structure.
Oh, God.
They build just standing armies in the world at the time. But here's the difference, guys. It's now being built with sepoys, indigenous soldiers. So the British never have a large standing army ever, right? In their whole history. They have a very large navy, but they don't have a large standing army. But they have the biggest standing army. Two things. They're being paid out of the tax revenues being collected by the British East India Company. And the British East India Company now does have the formal post-Mughal system, the legitimate rulers.
He's got the contract. He's handed over this piece of paper in the picture.
Yeah, he's given the Divani the sovereign powers over Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, large areas of northeastern India. And now they're building bureaucratic tax collecting, revenue raising structures, and they're building an indigenous army of sepoys that they're paying. And basically, they now have a military and a bureaucracy that is accountable only to one person, Clive. But I guess, Rachel, in that sense, he's a feudal lord because he's got an army and a bureaucracy that he controls of his own. But in a new modern twist, what he's supposed to be doing is he's supposed to be using half of the taxes they collect to maintain the bureaucracy in the army. In other words, he's supposed to collect 4 million pounds sterling a year. They're supposed to keep half maintain bureaucracy in their army, and then they're supposed to send half of it back to the British East India Company. They paid in and dividends the British East India Company, and in turn, they are the leading holders of government debt and the leading players on the London stock market. So this will also prop up the ailing London stock market, the ailing British public debt, and it will help. You have to understand the British are now in a crisis because they're so massively indebted from the 7 Years' War that they're having to find ways to meet their debt burden. And so that's why the British ministers, the British ruling class support Clive doing all of this, because not only does it prop up a key holder of public debt, British, the East India Company, and the London stock market, where the British East India Company is a blue chip private stock. It also, in a really key way, is also going to mean that the British can dominate the trade of this region, and that they can do it all. They can have a bureaucracy and a military, not with the British paying for it, because they can't afford to tax their own population anymore, okay? Because they basically have a massive debt at home. And every time they try and tax the local population in Britain, they get a tax riot because taxes have gone way up during the 7 Years' War and people don't want to pay them anymore. And furthermore, there's now a radical movement saying in Britain, you can't tax us without representing us. So the British ruling elite, the land elite, really don't want to raise taxes at home because it causes riots and it causes radicals to make claims that the British Parliament should become representative of the people it's taxing, which it's not representative of at all. And so they love what Clive is doing because it's a source of revenue that helps them prop up the British East India Company, the London stock market, and the public debt without having to tax their own population.
I was going to say, now please tell us about Lord North.
That they're going to move to tax the American colonists because they want.
And how all of this, in fact, is about the backstory of the American Revolution. I was like,
well,
I had to watch the 1776 musical this weekend just to go, oh my gosh, it all makes sense now.
The Divani in August.
Yes.
As that's happening in August of 1765, the Stamp Act is beginning to be enforced in America. And it has the exact same logic. Why did George Grenville send Robert Clive back to Bengal? It's the exact same reason why George Grenville passes for the first time in British history a direct tax on the colonists. They need revenue. They need revenue to help deal with this massive debt and tax burden they've developed during the 7 Years' War. And they can't raise it on their own population because their own population is pissed off about how high the taxes are. And their own population is starting to make claims that they should be better represented if they're going to be
England,
so highly taxed.
Right.
In
But
England,
and what
yes.
So this is what I realized when I've heard before things like, well, the American colonists are worried about the way in which the city or the parliament is becoming more imperial in its thinking. And that's why they're sending all these taxes, and the colonists have to deal with things like the tea tax. Here we'll have them throwing the tea into the harbor in Boston. And what there is a school of thought which I've read in more recent scholarship of the American Revolution. Oh, well, these weren't really that burdensome, kind of thing. But what I get from your book is they had a reason to be worried.
Oh, absolutely. They had two reasons to be worried. So one, by the time the Tea Act is passed in May of 1773, there's been two really important developments. The first development is in the American colonies itself, which is to say there's been at the end of the 7 Years' War, the British decide to tighten the screws on basically collecting revenue, not internally by directly taxing the colonies, but indirectly by collecting customs revenues. And they begin enforcing laws that haven't been enforced in 50 years called the laws of trade navigation. They bring an end to salutary neglect, enforcing laws that are on the books they haven't enforced in 50 years because they want to increase. Also, Act in 17. They passed the Stamp Act in 1765, which is a direct tax on the colonies, and ultimately protests. Why? Because the colonists don't tax themselves other than through their own assemblies. The colonists have a very strong conception of what we call not virtual representation, but actual representation. They have a very strong conception that you should only ever be taxed by a representative that you yourself elect and can control somebody who comes back to their constituency and has to deal with their constituency in regular elections. Most colonial assemblies have elections every couple of years, and they're highly representative. Like in Britain, only 1 out of 10 adult male votes. in colonial North America, 40 to 50% of the colonial adult male population votes. And you have to remember, the representative is not some great lord. He's by British standards, a common person who lives like the people he's representing. So he lives in and amongst them. And even people who can't vote, he has to deal with. They shout at him, they throw mud at him, So there's a real system. Colonial British North America is the most democratic place in the world in the mid-18th century. There's really no doubt about that. And they're very used to nothing can be done with them without going through their colonial assemblies. And the Stamp Act is a giant end run around the colonial assemblies. The Stamp Act says that a British parliament, a parliament of bewigged British gentlemen and aristocrats, without having to deal with a single American representative, can essentially raise a tax on the American colonists and use it for any purpose they want. So what the Stamp Act threatens to do is break the historic link in colonial North America between taxation and representation. And that's why it's so opposed, Rachel. It is a relatively light tax. It's a relatively light tax, but you have to keep in mind two things. One, it's a tax on a stamp, and you need a stamp to make any document official. If you want a birth certificate to be official, it has to be stamped. If you want a legal testament, a will, a death certificate to be official, it has to be stamped. If you want a deposition, a legal deposition to be accepted in court, it has to be stamped. If you want a trade bill, it has to be stamped. So suddenly every merchant, every lawyer, every newspaperman, anybody who wants any kind of official certificate needs to pay the stamp tax. It's a light tax. Sorry? That's a great example, Casey. It's a marriage certificate. Exactly. So it comes home to every colonist that we now pay a tax that is in no way, shape, and form raised by our assembly or our representatives, but is being raised by a British land elite far away in London that never, ever interacts with us. They never come over here. They don't have to deal with any of our representatives. They're totally and wholly unrepresentative of us, right? They're nothing like us. They don't know our ways of life, etc. And that's the problem with the Stamp Act. And they force the British to repeal the Stamp Act. And then the British try and bring it in through the back door through something called the Townshend Acts. They basically say, okay, you don't like us doing a direct tax. What we're going to do is we're going to set up all these custom collectors in your ports. And we're going to pass import taxes on key items coming in: lead, glass, paper, tea, other things. And basically, nude riot is the Townshend riots. And all imperial authority is lost in America by 1768-69. And so finally in 1770, the British ruling class decides we're going to withdraw all the taxes except one, the tax on tea, the Townshend import duty on tea. And the reason why they keep the Townshend import duty on tea is they say it's a mark of our control, meaning the view in Britain is that Parliament is the absolute sovereign power over the colonists. So Parliament has the right to raise all these taxes, the Stamp Act, the Townshend duties. So while they're forced to, for practical reasons, because they've lost control in America by 1770, they're forced to withdraw these taxes to mollify the colonial American resistance movement, the colonial population, but they keep the one on tea as a marker of their absolute sovereignty. And the other side of the coin here is what's going on in Asia. The British East India Companies brought all this tea in from China and India.
Okay.
And this is where they're moving plantations to India and growing tea there and all of that, right? And they're bringing their tea in. And you have to understand, now it's known throughout colonial American newspapers that a British East India Company is this horrible despotic ruling force. To use Rachel's term, it's like a feudal lord, but it's a feudal lord that is a profit-seeking commercial monopolist as well. So you have a lord. Main purpose is to serve
just if we say it like this, is like explains so much about. I mean, and they're not wrong, right? They're not wrong. The long-term effects of the British control of that industry in India is terrible. So I'm like, I'm feeling very American after reading your book. It's like, oh, right, with the colony, they actually had a point, right? It wasn't like just craziness. They had a feel for the power and the tension and the networks of things that they were caught in. Yeah, well, it was about the tea, but it was about It was this. I mean, what James is describing is the symbol, but it's also they recognized the effects of these trade arrangements on their actual liberty, which
Absolutely.
is interesting because their sense of liberty is not what those Whigs mean. It's it right. Do we have an equivocation about their liberties? They want their own assemblies to be able to make the decisions about what happens in their revenue raising, and
Yeah, this is called actual representation,
right,
as opposed to virtual.
And the Whig
Yeah.
liberty is, these oligarchs who want to be free of the king oversight of their commerce. Yeah.
Yes. The Whigs view the great enemy as racism, and the colonial American patriots view the great enemy as unrepresentative government.
Which is easy to confuse
government.
if you just say, oh, it's
Any
about
government.
liberty. The British, great British liberties versus, and it's like they're not the same thing.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so the Whigs who are ruling in Britain don't understand how the Americans are sitting there in arbitrary power.
That's great.
And the Americans say, you're an arbitrary. They say, how can we be an arbitrary power? We're ruling through Parliament. Everything we've done to you has been through parliamentary laws. And our definition of liberty is any law passed by Parliament. As long as the Crown's agents are operating through laws passed by Parliament, that is liberty. But the colonial American conception is liberty is that the people that actually are ruled can hold their rulers accountable, either through directly electing them or harassing them in local life when they're back in their constituency. And they don't think British aristocrats and gentlemen, not only should they not tax them because they're not elected by them, but they also don't live amongst them. And they'll never know their ways of life, and they'll never be able to be held accountable by protests and parades and newspapers and just social pressure and all of that.
That, I mean,
yes, that's right. There's nothing like that in the colonies. Nobody has inherited positions in politics. But
well, the Moguls were
in the House of Lords, those are aristocratic peerages. They're inherited. But to bring it full circle, the East India Company now is, or sorry, I apologize. Rather, what's happened is the East India Company is bringing all this tea back to, and by the way, Clive's abuses are legion, meaning you have to imagine the British East India Company now rules Bengal, but it's still a for-profit commercial company trading in London. So unshockingly, Clive decides, not only am I going to, administer law and order and provide external defense and collect revenues, but I'm also going to use all these powers to institute a monopsony on the Bengali economy, meaning the British East India Company gives itself the right to be the first purchaser of all these textiles. Rachel, this is the beginning of the destruction of the Bengali textile industry. Because the merchant is running a country, and the merchant is saying, well, I'm going to run the country and I'm going to use all the powers of public power to give me the right of first purchase. You have to remember, Clive is just the representative of the British East India Company. So he's using his absolute powers to give the British East India Company the right of first purchase. So now all of these common textile weavers and spinners in Bengal, they have to first sell their textiles to the company for the price the company sets. Right? And that's ruinous for the economy. It's if you're a common spinner and weaver in Bengal, you want as many people bidding for your textiles as possible to get the best price possible. Now there's only one initial bidder, the British East India Company. And so it's really ruinous. And eventually it helps that now Bengal does have famines. The British don't create the famine, but the famine that hits in the late 60s is much worse than it's ever been before because of the economic depression the East India Company has introduced. Right. And by the way, the British East India Company is collecting a much higher rate of tax than the Mughals did. And you have to imagine all the people who run the British East India Company in Bengal, they don't view themselves as Bengali. They don't live there. Their goal is to make a killing as quickly as possible and to move back to Britain and live very well. So they never think about themselves as a genuine government. Governors, however abusive they may be, ultimately have to like live amongst the people that they're abusing. The British East India Company, all of these high officials that run the military, the bureaucracy, and the economy, they just view themselves as temporarily there. They're only going to be there a few years. They want to make as much profit as possible. They want to pump out as much wealth as they can to go back to Britain. That's how they get rewarded back in
Right.
Britain, is if revenues are being collected and sent back. And so it's the worst possible system anyone could have ever invented to run a country. It's the worst. There has never been, I think, a crazier political system established. And by the way, this is being read in British and colonial newspapers all the time. Okay. And the colonists basically come to view what Robert Clive done, what the British East India Company is doing in Bengal, as the purest possible expression of a government that is in no way, shape, or form accountable or representative of the people over whom it governs. And the colonists begin to suspect that this is just the bridgehead, the beginning of an imperial plot to make the whole empire like this.
Right. The American.
So now, guys, you're in May 1773. And basically, the British East India Company has all of this tea sitting in London. And it can't directly sell this tea to America. It has to put this tea on auction for tea merchants to purchase and then to export to America. But the British East India Company is in really big trouble by late 72. Why? Because they're absolutely, I don't know how else to put this, but they have the most greedy, extractive policies. From 1765 to 1772, no area of the world has ever been worse run as Bengal is being run. I mean, I don't know that. How can I know that? But my view is that what's happening to the Bengali people is the worst form of government that exists anywhere in the world in the 18th century. And it's led to starvation, famine, poverty, misery. And unsurprisingly, as a result, you can't really raise a lot of revenues from people that you've immiserated. They can't pay their taxes. So the East India Company is not able, not only can it not pay for its own bureaucracy and military, it can't send any money back to London. And so it's going bankrupt by late 72. And the board of directors of the East India Company has to go hat in hand to Prime Minister Lord North and King George III and say, guys, we're going bankrupt. And if we go bankrupt, we'll crash the public credit and we'll crash the London stock market. And so this is why Lord North and George III decide that they need to pass a Tea Act. And what does the Tea Act do? It allows the British company to directly sell tea to America, which is designed to help them increase their profits and make themselves more financially solvent, and therefore to prop themselves up in London and to prop up the system of government debt and public credit and the private London stock market. And as a result, you now have ships coming from London that are going to basically directly sell East India Company tea. And another thing is happening, guys. All of these ships, all of these huge cargoes of tea are coming in 73. They're going to land. The Tea Act is passed in May. And so we're headed to fall and winter 3. And all of these gigantic with huge cargoes of tea. And when they land, they're going to pay the Townsend duty on tea. Remember, that's the one tea the British kept as a marker of their absolute parliamentary sovereignty over the colonies. And so the colonists are basically hugely upset about this. Why? Because the British East India Company not only is given the right to directly export tea to America, but it doesn't have to pay the customs duty in Britain. So it's going to be able to come to America and pay the Townsend import duty, but still undersell other tea dealers. So it will, within a year, probably become a competitor to dominate the tea market in America, right? So the vision here of the colonists, particularly of these groups that have formed called the Sons of Liberty, it's really the Sons of Liberty driving all of this. They do not want the company. The company is the ships with the company.
That's local history here
in South Carolina. They're coming to Savannah in Georgia. They're coming to New York.
Yeah.
Right. They're coming
A
to New
lot.
York
So,
City.
and what
they're
I'm
coming,
trying to get to the
coming to
scale
Boston,
in this
coming to
is, I
Portsmouth,
mean,
New
we
Hampshire.
have
They're
like
coming
the big
everywhere.
ships in the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, but the equivalent now would be, it's like you send all the container ships full of something that you're now going to force the population to purchase, and it's a I don't know whether it's the big drug cartel version of things, but it's certainly there. This is huge, and yeah.
That's exactly right. And so the colonial American resistance movement, principally the Sons of Liberty, who published lots of newspapers and pamphlets, they have come to conclude after the passage of the Tea Act, and as these large cargoes of tea are sailing to arrive in fall winter 73, they have come to conclude that the British East India Company is a completely arbitrary and despotic power that has ruined the people. And now happening is the British ruling class is going to prop up the British East India Company and its despotic rule in Bengal by helping them sell tea in America. And eventually the British East India Company will have a foothold in America because they'll be able to undersell all of the smaller tea dealers. And then once they are the only sellers of tea in America, they'll have a monopoly on it and a foothold in America. And furthermore, just to conclude, guys, I know I've gone on too long. Remember, the British East India Company is paying the Townsend duty, right? The smaller tea smugglers were, the smaller tea merchants were smugglers and interlopers. They were invading, paying the Townsend duty. And the colonists loved this because they didn't think the Townsend duty was legitimate because it was a tax raised by Parliament and not by their own assemblies. But now you're going to have a gigantic East India Company tea business that is going to eliminate all the smugglers because nobody will buy the smuggled tea because the East India Company has economy scale. It can sell its tea much cheaper and it will pay the Townsend duty. And then the Townsend duty means all this revenue is being raised on the American colonists that will go back to Parliament that has raised this tax on them without dealing with any of their representatives. And then the British Parliament is going to use this revenue essentially to set policy in America. And essentially the colonial American assemblies will become completely surplus to requirements. They will be reduced to talk shops because now Parliament will have all of this colonial revenue that comes not from the colonial assemblies, but comes from a tax that Parliament itself has raised, just like the Stamp Act. And so the view of the colonists is this tea coming into Boston Harbor, Charleston Harbor, Savannah Harbor, New York Harbor is all the beginning of an attempt to replace slavery, by which, of course, the end of representative government, the end of nobody being able to take your property without an elected representative that you can hold accountable passing a law that says they can take part of your private property. And
Right.
Yeah, that's a brilliant way to refer to it, tax farm. And that's what the Sons of Liberty have to patiently explain at town and county meetings in rural farm areas and in town halls and in pamphlets. And of course, what happens is you often get these historians, particularly, I'm sorry to say this, but historians in Britain who will say, oh, this is crazy slavery. It's such a paranoid style, right? This idea. And the truth is, yes, these are small amounts of money initially, but once you establish the principle that the landed elite, the aristocrats and the gentlemen in the House of Lords and the House of Commons can raise taxes on the colonial population without ever having to consult any of their colonial assemblies or having to have a single American representative in the House of Commons of House of Lords, you establish the principle that Parliament can do this whenever it wants to, and that the East India Company can have a foothold in America. And yes, maybe they're only doing it for emergency reasons right now, but there will always be future emergencies. And the Sons of Liberties basically spell out, we will basically be Bengal. And this is why, very famously, John Dickinson, his second most famous pamphlet says, he says basically, eventually there will not be assemblies, there will be nabobs and nizams. There will be Oriental despots, And he doesn't mean this in a racist or racialist way. He basically means these Oriental despots will be local governors that simply rule on behalf of the British landed elite in Parliament. And the British landed elite will always decide to tax the colonists over their own population because they don't want it to deal with their own population's riots and protests, whereas they don't have to deal with our riots and protests. And by the way, one of the things that the Townsend duties is supposed to be used for, guys, and I'm sorry I failed to mention this, is to fund a 10,000-man Redcoat army in America that is totally responsible to King George III. But that's exactly right.
And I'm thinking it's like we're looking now at all the data centers that are being planted everywhere. Right.
Yeah,
it's like, there's one there. I was just seeing something today about the one they want to plant north of where my mom lives in Amarillo. Right. It's like, oh, it'll be near Pantex. I'm sure they're going to use it for the bomb assembly. But these, our federal government is behaving this way of being able to plant things in region, like local places that don't want it, and they're saying, where's our sense of this is our land? In Amarillo, it's our water. Right, which we're using to grow other stuff like cotton, which I always thought was a little crazy in the desert, but whatever, right? And so it's like this all feels so topical. And you say the revolution, the colonists at the revolution understood. They would look at what's going on right now and be like horrified, I think, because it's exactly the kind of commercial military government entanglement that they were fighting against.
Yes, they believe when the Sons of Liberty dress up as indigenous people, board the ships in Boston Harbor, midnight, December 16th, 1773, and throw that's the single greatest, by the way, act of property damage in colonial history, because that's
right.
Tens of thousands of pounds sterling they're dumping. They think that a 10-man army that is only responsible not to the population it's stationed in, but to King George III and to Parliament. They think they're overthrowing the Townsend duty in T, which represents the principle of a unrepresentative Parliament taxing them. And they ultimately think they're overthrowing arbitrary, despotic, unaccountable government. That's what they think they're doing. Right?
Well, I'm very proud.
That's what
American
they're throwing
right
over and trying to get rid of.
I mean, seriously. And I really wish, I wish I would have been taught this, right? It's like when we say, why aren't we taught American history? The particular entanglements that they're protesting against are real, and that they've seen it they've seen Clive and the East India Company do it elsewhere. That's like so staggering to me that we don't. I mean, it's like we're talking about in our department now, we talk about we need to have global history and things like that. This is why, because you don't have just, it's just a story that has to do with, New York or Charleston or Boston. It's like this already was in this. It's the same story. We see these kinds of, it's like whether it's the institutions, but just structural functions coming out of these sorts of business and political arrangements over and over and over again. It's staggering to me.
Absolutely. Right. And that's that, to go back to something you said earlier, Rachel, that they take this whole Whig language and they democratize it.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning the Whig oligarchy only thought of liberty about putting limits on a crown. And they really come to think of it as a government that is genuinely accountable to the population it governs. Right. And it's really the first, I mean, I'm not just saying this in some patriotic sensibility. It really is the first real breakthrough of, in 18th century terms, popular sovereignty, right? That is to say that not the principle that the crown has to be subject to a parliament, but the principle that the government has to be subject
we the people,
to the government.
That's what they meant.
Yes. Right. And they create a regime that lasts. I mean, everybody else who does it, the other reason why I think the American Revolution is a genuinely global event is there are other people. I don't know, Casey, if you're familiar with this. Rachel's likely to be. There's a famous book by a guy named Robert Palmer called The Age of the Democratic Revolution. And what he points out is that while there are these revolts all over the West in the late 18th century, he wrote this book in the 1950s, that it's the American Revolution that is the only one that creates a regime that continues to this day, which means when he was writing in the 50s, which is to say, the French are on the Fifth Republic, and that it's the only regime created in this period of uprisings based on popular sovereignty that lasts into the 20th century.
The Constitution
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
Well, so now we know why Beckett's the bad guy. That was amazing, right? It's like, thank you so much, because I like you realize I'm reading his book last week and going, oh my gosh, it all makes so much sense now. Because unfortunately, I think a lot of times we're taught the American story simply as a political problem, and so the T doesn't make any sense. And it would, at least in civics class, or the way in which I growing up was shown it's the government, but it's not what the government was trying to, what kind of government they're making so as to protect against what, right? And the sort of Parliament and King versus Parliament layers of things did not make sense to me until you bring in the way Parliament is funding itself with the empire already, with Clive and the East India Company, and then to see that we're still wrestling with this monopolies that come in and take over locations and impoverish them. I mean,
Yeah.
Oh my gosh!
And this fusion of public power, absolutely, right?
Yes, horrible abuse of public power.
Yeah, and it's a real shame because I think there's so much. There's a lot of people get stopped on the taxation and say no, but
Right.
it's also connected to representation, right? There's these kind of two narratives that are really powerful, neither of which are like a kind of libertarian narrative on the right, that it's just about small government and little taxes,
Right.
right? And then there's what I'll just refer to as the 1619 Project narrative on the left, which is that it's some kind of revolt in favor of slavery. And that's, we don't have to get off on that tangent now, but that's just an absurd view of it. Yes, there's slavery before and after the American Revolution, but that doesn't mean there wasn't a genuine revolution, a genuine defense of liberty. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Okay, guys. Read his book, right? Because if you're going to understand, it's so modest, although it has an elephant on the front. We approve elephants. We also have elephants in our story. It's the politics of empire at the accession of George III, the East India Company, and the crisis and transformation of Britain's imperial state. It will unlock the mysteries for you. So here's my jewel of the Mosaic Ark is. Thank you so much for joining us, James, and that was wonderful.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Casey, for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
We will now be singing your praises for the rest of time, as we're trying to help people understand why we get trapped. Right? It's like this is and I appreciate your political framing at the end. It's saying we get trapped on both of these extreme sides too, right? This the libertarian side and the 1619 version of things, and miss in fact how much we're still in this story, because we're still in this problem of where the monopolies come from, how the government uses certain companies to prop itself up, where the patronage comes from. That was another thing that I learned. You're talking about how the British oligarchy is very interested in using the East India Company as a source of where they can get, it's useful for them as patronage. that they can appoint people to these bureaucracy in India, and everybody gets enriched, and it's the whole social, like,
Oh, absolutely.
heaven forbid we're
And I'm
talking
starting
about the Epstein files, right? But you're talking about the network of, favors that people can use.
Oh, absolutely. And as the French Revolution breaks out and puts massive pressure on the British landed elite to reform the kind of worst aspects of
Right.
corruption at home and patronage, they've got this endless reserve of patronage in India. You can send every idiot second son of the Marquis of so and so and the Baron of so and so to go have a high government position in India.
Mhm.
And the Indian people have a huge burden, which is basically their kind of the outdoor welfare of the British ruling elite for a very long time.
Yeah.
No, and it's the British Raj never. I mean, the British East India Company never thinks about developing the capacities of India. It just thinks about what can we take out of India in a short-term sense. It never thinks about genuine wealth is growing the wealth of the people as a whole, and that will bring you in more wealth over time. It doesn't think about
My
that.
my
right?
favorite sort of coda irony in all of this is John Stuart Mill worked for them. There he is. He's writing on liberty after the East India Company has been nationalized or taken over in
Become the
1850, taken over by the crown. It's like, did you notice, Mr. Mill, you were working for?
Yeah, the company Raj becomes the crown Raj in the 1850s.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. We've kept you up past your evening bedtime. I hope you go have you go.
I'm sorry I went too long, and it's been really enjoyable. Thank you guys both.
We love when we get our guests talking. Keep going. We should have a cup of tea right now, but all I have is wine. So, cheers.
I'm drinking very,
You are
very, very,
excellent. Excellent.
That's a great point.
Well, thank you again for joining us. Thanks, guys, for hanging out with it. John Abrisi held on longest in Australia, so thank you, John. We need to have John on to tell the Australian story now, so that we have the opposite poles. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much, and we will see you next time.